Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And today's webinar will be how to protect your property. And this is sponsored by the Great Lakes Coalition, the Michigan Municipal League, United Shoreline Ontario, Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence River Alliance, and Save Our Sodas. Before I go into introducing the speakers, I want to go through just a few admin details. So first of all, if I get disconnected, please do not disconnect yourselves. I have 3 minutes to come back in. We don't have any bad weather. My internet's stable, so that should not be an issue. But if I do get kicked off, then you do have 3 minutes. So I have 3 minutes to come back in. Second of all lines are muted, and we do that because we have a lot of people on this call, and that just really helps us manage the background noise and so forth. If you do hear barking in the background, that is probably my dog, and I apologize for that up front. We have 4 remote speakers. Please be patient during changeovers. None of us are professional presenters, at least I'm not, and since I'm the one driving the presentation, I apologize up front for any errors. So first we'll have John Alice with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, then Greg Whitecamp, who is with, I'm sorry, I got to move my camera for a second, Edgewater Resources and Marinas, then Mike Utflecht, with the Army Corps of Engineers as well, and then finally Dave Dingle from Ontario, Canada, who will each present their material. Questions and answers will be at the end. There is a question box in your control panel. That's on the right-hand side of your screen in all likelihood, unless you moved it. You can control some of the things there, and you can also ask questions in the questions tab. I will see those, and we will go through those at the end. And so that being the introduction, I'm now going to turn it over to John. John, you should be live.
All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I'll try and kick off here. I'm John Ellis. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Detroit, and I'm in charge of our office that handles water level forecasting and monitoring on the Great Lakes. So got about 10 minutes here to try and make you all experts in Great Lakes water levels, what drives them, where they're going. So I'll try and do that without getting into too much of the nitty-gritty details. So we'll see if I can straddle that line. Okay, the first thing I wanted to start off with here, I know we have a lot of people probably from various points, all over the Great Lakes system, but, I'd like to start off with, all this high water that we've been dealing with across the Great Lakes. It's really been, a system-wide issue over the last year. Each lake has maybe experienced their worst moments at slightly different times, but all the lakes have been at or above record highs at some point over the last year, and that's obviously been caused significant issues for everybody along the coast. Whether it's erosion or flooding or maybe even some of both. It's really has been a system-wide issue. So those of you experiencing it, maybe in your specific corner of the Great Lakes, know that you're not alone. This is something that's been very widespread along the Great Lakes over the last year. And so talking about the Great Lakes system, I'd like to just start off to highlight a couple of things here on this map. One is just how large the Great Lakes are. One of the largest freshwater systems in the world. So obviously very large lakes, very large drainage basin. And so, to kind of orient you to how water moves through the system, the profile on the bottom left graphic there shows you roughly, how water moves. You have Lake Superior up at the northernmost edge of the Great Lakes Basin, essentially, where water would come in and then work its way down, from there down to the St. Mary's River into Lakes Michigan and Huron, through the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, Detroit River Corridor, into Lake Erie, and then over Niagara Falls into Lake Ontario, and then essentially water would leave the Great Lakes system down the St. Lawrence River. The thing to point out here is, again, we have this very large basin, but we do have 2 points in the system where outflow can be controlled between one lake and the other. I won't be able to get into a lot of the nuances of how that's controlled and regulation plans and the international structure. I may have some time to answer questions about that. But the takeaway I just want to leave you with is, again, very large system, and with only these 2 points of control, for the outflow, minimal, there's not a lot you can do for water levels from an outflow regulation point of view, especially on the upper lakes between Superior and Michigan Huron, maybe a little more so down on the Ontario St. Lawrence end. But ultimately, these all the high water situations we've been dealing with are going to be driven by Mother Nature on the Great Lakes. All right, I'll cover some basic kind of terms and concepts here before I get into the more exciting parts of the presentation. When I talk water levels on the Great Lakes, I'll typically be talking about lake-wide average levels. And so what do I mean by that? There are a series of water level gauges along the shores of the Great Lakes. We have them here, on the map. You can see, on the U.S. and Canadian side. So anytime we're going to talk about the water level of a lake, we're going to be talking about an average level using a network of gauges around that lake, and then essentially just averaging those to come up with what that lake-wide average level would be. And so that's important that that's just a still water mean elevation of the lake. So there may be depending on where you are around the lake, that actual localized level is going to vary quite a bit from what that lake-wide still water level would be. Whether you have wind and waves coming in from a significant storm causing the water to rise, or even when we get some longer duration wind events, water can almost pile up on one side of the lake or the other, like water in a bathtub, and slosh back and forth. We call those seiches. And so anyways, I'll be talking a lot about just the still water aspect, but note that actual water level you're experiencing at any given time, can obviously change quite a bit due to other more localized phenomenon. A couple other things to point out, from a time scale point of view, typically, we're talking about lake-wide average levels on a daily time step. So we'll come up with daily averages that we track. And then we also roll those up into monthly water level averages, which is primarily how we look at long periods of time when we're analyzing water levels over the Great Lakes, or when we're producing forecasts. We'll be forecasting out that monthly mean level, not necessarily trying to project what those daily fluctuations would be. All right, like I mentioned a couple slides ago, that I said Mother Nature has really been driving these high water events. So this is just a very simple summary of the natural factors that drive water level fluctuations in the Great Lakes, and you can break it down pretty simply here that you're going to have water coming into a lake from that upstream lake ahead of it, as I showed in the profile. You're going to have water that then leaves that lake down to the next lake in the system. But then you also have this term that we like to lump together, into what we call net basin supply, and that's the evaporation, that's leaving the lake off the lake surface. It's the precipitation that's falling directly onto the lake, and then the runoff from the surrounding watershed throughout the streams and tributaries that feed water to the lake. And that's the term really. You can look at that as kind of the water that Mother Nature is bringing in and out of the system, and so it's helpful for us to track net basin supply to get an idea, roughly of how wet or how dry conditions have been. And so again, those when you're trying to figure out what water levels are going to do and how they're reacting, these are the components that make up those water level fluctuations. All right, another very basic graphic here. The Great Lakes operate, or I would say fluctuate similar to any other inland lake. There's, they're going to follow a natural seasonal cycle or a seasonal pattern over the course of a year, where Water levels over the winter, are typically lower as a lot of the precipitation's just accumulating on the shoreline, or the basin as snow, not really melting and making its way into the lake. You tend to have higher evaporation rates, so the lakes will just naturally be low over the winter. But then as that snow melts, or that snow starts to melt and work its way into the basin, you're going to have this spring rise, typically, with water levels usually peaking, early to late summer, depending on which lake you're talking about. And then, typically we'll see, things start to dry a bit more at the end of the summer. We'll start to see some increased evaporation rates, and that will then fuel that seasonal decline. So just pointing out again that lakes are naturally going to fluctuate through this rough seasonal cycle year to year. All right, so this gets into some of the more interesting stuff here for you all. So what we have here is a long time series here of our period of record of our recorded water levels on each of the Great Lakes. So we have lake-wide average levels that are very reliable back to 1918. So that's where we start our period of record here. So so what you're seeing are those monthly averaged still water levels recorded 1918 to present. Yeah, and again, you can see here we have that for each of the lakes. So this is helpful to put in context of where we are now and give you a little bit, again, context historically of what we've seen over the past. So some things you would want to notice here. You can see each of the lakes have fluctuated between periods of high water and periods of low water. And you can see you have a bunch of those periods over the last 100 years where we may spend a significant amount of time in one regime or the other, flipping between the two, and that's been pretty natural. We've shaded here just because most people will probably remember this. We had it was a decade and actually a little bit more on the upper lakes where we had significant low water, a significant low water period where levels were consistently low. Actually, I think for Michigan here on Superior, that was the longest stretch, continued stretch of below average water levels anywhere in that period of record. And certainly towards the end of that period, we were dealing with a lot of concerns about whether this was climate change. Is this just the way it's going to be in the future? Are we going to see low water now? And you can see then, how quickly things have rebounded after that. Over a 2-year period coming off that low water level era, and we saw some of the largest 2-year rises anywhere in the period of record as conditions have just really kind of flipped a switch and started to get much wetter, driving levels up to where we have kind of circled where we are now. I guess the other point of context here to note, you can see where we've been up at these record highs here in 2019, 2020, and you can look back and see that although we've set new record highs, there have been other high water periods similar. Certainly when you're looking at Michigan and Huron, we're very close to those record highs that we had back in the late 80s. But levels were also almost as high back in the kind of mid 70 era. So again, water levels have naturally fluctuated between these high and low periods. Again, reaching record highs and close to record highs, and same with record lows at multiple points over the last 100 years of data here. And I could probably go through all sorts of slides trying to describe why levels are so high right now, but it really has been boils down to just simply how wet conditions have been. If you look at the Great Lakes Basin over the last 1 year, 2 year, I think 3 year and 5 year periods, each of those have been the wettest period on record for each of those respective time steps. And this graph here, it helps to illustrate that. You can see, Great Lakes Basin, if you look at the precipitation as a whole over the basin, the long-term graph of that, you can see how, as we've gotten into the late 2000s here, kind of mid 2000s to late, we've been in this upward trend where we've just seen more and more precipitation. And so, again, kind of oversimplifies things to some extent, but really it's just been really wet, and that's driven the the current situation that we're dealing with right now. All right, so these next few slides, I'll walk you through a little bit more detail of where we've been over the last year or two, and then where water levels are forecasted to be over the next 6 months. So this is a many of you on the call may be familiar with this product. This is our 6-month forecast that the Corps produces and coordinates with Canada. And so I'll orient those of you that may not be familiar to what you're looking at here. So the red line is that's showing the monthly mean recorded water levels. Here we're looking at Lake Superior, and showing that from 2018 through 2019 into 2020. So you can see where the recorded levels have been. That blue dashed line is what the long-term average level would be. So each month has an average value for that specific month. So if you were just to follow the average seasonal pattern, you can see the line that you'd be following. Then what we have here, we've got bars at the top, kind of the top of that range with dates. Those are the record high monthly means for each of those respective months, along with the year that had been previously set. And then far away from our minds right now from what we're dealing with, but down at the bottom you have the record lows along with the years those were set. So you can see, looking here specifically at Lake Superior, we've put a box around the record highs that were set in 2019. So, Lake Superior set, let me see, I think that's 4 different record highs, 5 back through 2019. And so very high water on Lake Superior. We even set a couple of new record highs here in January and February to start off 2020. But conditions have actually started to dry a bit over the spring, in the Lake Superior watershed. And so you see that bear out, and that levels have started to drop a bit further below the record highs that we were dealing with last year. Moving forward, from that red line where it kind of goes into this cone, that's showing our forecasted water levels over the next 6 months for that lake. The green represents our most probable line, and then the red banding kind of straddles 90% confidence range for us. If we see pretty wet conditions, levels could return to that upper end of the range of that shaded area. If we see drier conditions, obviously we'd follow that lower end of the range. But gives you some idea for Lake Superior that, again, we've seen a little bit of relief, still very high, but we're really not projecting record high levels unless things really get much wetter. All right, looking forward here onto Michigan Huron. Very exact same graph, so I'll orient you to it. But you can see again that we didn't quite set any record highs on Michigan Huron in 2019, but the levels came very close. I believe that July monthly mean was just less than an inch below the previous record high set in '86. What we saw in Michigan Huron is we didn't see things dry up quite so much over the spring. Things have stayed wetter, and you'll notice you would typically see a seasonal decline if you were really to follow just average conditions from June down into January, February, and we had very small decline last year. You can see it almost just stayed level from the fall all the way through the spring before levels started to rise again. So that really set the stage, for what we're dealing with here on Michigan Huron, where levels have been well above record highs each month so far to start off 2020. You can see, the forecast moving forward. That July peak that we're forecasting, it's just, I think it's less than an inch below that October 1986 peak, which is the highest monthly mean we have in the period of record. So obviously very high levels, close to as high levels as we've experienced on Michigan Huron over the last 100 years. So if we follow average conditions, we're projecting we may be back below record highs, in October. But the takeaway here really is levels are going to be high regardless, on Michigan Huron going into the fall when we hit a more active, wind, wave, storm periods. So still a lot of high water level concerns to be dealing with on Michigan Huron for the rest of the year. St. Clair, much smaller lake. Obviously it's going to be, driven heavily by conditions on Michigan Huron and the amount of flow leaving that lake. So you can see following very similar trends to what Michigan and Huron did. That lake was slightly higher. Did set records last year in addition to the records it's been setting this year. So again, Lake St. Clair, you can summarize as almost the exact same story as Michigan and Huron. Erie also, set new record highs, for a pretty large period of last year, hitting peak levels. And then again, this year it has not been drying up, in this Michigan Huron to Erie corridor like we've seen on Superior. So levels have continued to set record highs all the way through May. We are starting to seem to reach the seasonal peak on Erie, so we may not set further records. For the rest of the year on Lake Erie. Although again, you can see how close we are. So still water levels very high, still very problematic, for those impacted by high levels along the coast. And moving, down to the end of the system, Lake Ontario, you can see what Lake Ontario levels we're dealing with, last year, the same story as the rest of the lakes, very, very high peak there. In the spring and summer, setting new record highs in June and July, and I think those broke records that had just been set in 2017. So, a pretty sustained high water period there on Lake Ontario, causing the same significant impacts there. But we have also, similar to the Lake Superior Basin, have started to get some relief with some drying in the basin, some drying in the some of the key basins that feed the St. Lawrence River that have allowed levels to be maintained a little bit lower there on Lake Ontario. So while they're certainly above average, we're significantly below record highs right now, and not forecasting any record highs even under the wettest conditions here for the rest of the year on Lake Ontario. And so with that, I won't talk much to these next two slides, but so you have it, through our website with the Corps, we've, again, all the information I presented here, forecasts, historical water levels, basin conditions, we have all that through various links on our website. I've left contact information here, so certainly happy for any of those people after this webinar in the future. If you're looking for more information, would be glad to answer your questions and follow up with you. And with that, Bernie, I think I'm ready to pass this back on to the next presenter.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Am I coming through in audio?
Yes.
Okay, so good. Yeah, there's a bunch of questions already came in, and so please don't go anywhere. We'll have lots of questions on your presentation. I have one as well. In the meantime, I'm going to turn this over to Greg, who's our next speaker. Greg, you should now be able to share your screen. There you go.
Can you see and hear me?
Yeah, it's not in presentation mode yet, but you're good to go. Yep.
Give me just 1 second here.
Perfect. I'll go back on mute. Take it away.
Very good. Thank you. Again, my name is Greg Wykamp. I'm with Edgewater Resources. We are a coastal engineering, marina and waterfront planning and design firm based in St. Joseph, Michigan. We also have offices up in Madison and down in Florida. And we spend all of our time working with clients facing these issues. So John's gone through a lot about the long-term cyclical water levels. What I want to show you today or talk about today is how those things actually impact the shoreline and how that homeowners can work together with the permitting agencies and contractors to move forward and protect your shoreline. So this is St. Joseph, Michigan, for example. And we have some pretty big waves on Lake Michigan, as you can tell, and that can just as easily look like this. And these are actually only a year apart from 2013 and 2014. This is with that low water period John talked about, but this was a storm just the following year. And so the water levels that John was talking about are generally static levels. That's the water level that you see on a calm day. We all have to prepare for the storms and the run-up and the storm surge and those sorts of things. So just want to talk about what you as a homeowner or a property owner or a municipality need to be thinking about is monitoring those water levels and projections, looking ahead. We work with a lot of clients who some want to prepare very early and have been looking at strategies for protecting the shorelines for years. And on the other end of it, we literally have clients call us and want to know if they can have a stone armor revetment system installed next week, which is obviously a real challenge. So looking ahead and paying attention and monitoring what's going on is really critically important. You want to make sure that you inspect shoreline systems if you've got them to make sure that they're holding up and they don't need to be repaired. Make sure that anything that's plugging up drains and those sorts of things is cleared. And then just always think about the wind setup and surge conditions and seiche conditions. And a seiche is when you have that wind setup and a wind setup literally pushes the surface of the water up from one side of the lake to the other, and you can, in a very short period of time, have an increase in water level of about 2 feet in St. Joe, and that ranges in different areas. In Buffalo, you might see as much as 4 feet. So it's dependent on your geography and the conditions of your lake. You need to be aware of that. But this chart here really kind of explores Lake Michigan and its record ranges. And so the average is right here. And we use this chart, this datum called low water datum, which is just a tool that makes it easy for us to talk about water levels. But so low water datum here at 0 is not necessarily the lowest point, as in 2013 we were down here below minus 1.1. And right now we're up here at about 4.5-ish in that range. The record was in '86 is 4.85, but you see this red line up here. That's when you have a surge condition, and that the lake is temporarily raised with a surge condition. And then of course when we have those surge conditions, it's usually associated with waves. And so we like to think through these issues about where the water is going to hit your shoreline. And in a wall condition, you have issues. And then if you have a long run up on your shoreline, all of those things affect how far the wave and water energy will go towards your property. You've got to keep those things in mind. So when you think about a wind setup, this is one day here. This water, I want you to look at the level of this area here and the dock here, and how quickly that water can raise that dock, and how close those are. It's the same place, just the next day. So it's important to keep that in mind. When you think about strategies, it's easy to start to think first in terms of rock and shoreline armoring and steel walls and all those kinds of things. But that's not the first strategy we like to think about. And I want you to look at this shoreline. This is St. Joseph, Michigan. And it all looks good. And I want you to notice this house up here. And one of the things that we ask our clients to think about is when you're making decisions, just because something can be permitted doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. So this home was put out, and you'll notice there's sort of a natural line of where all these older houses were. And I always encourage homeowners when they're looking at a property or looking about building something is to stand out there and look around and go, is what I'm proposing to do, has somebody else done it, and has it been in place for 50 or 100 years, and are they still there? And you'll notice that line, these may all be new houses, but they've been replaced in the same place as the old houses. And then this house is a little bit further out on the shoreline there. You can quickly see what's coming. This is not hard to see. So when you look in plan view here, it's a little faint on the screen, I imagine, but you can see these red lines, and those represent water levels at various high level conditions over the years. So in 1985, it was here, for example. And so clearly that's not a place I would like to have my house. And when you think about what has happened in this case is the water comes up, and in a picture of the same place a few weeks later, the water was actually much, much closer. So ultimately, that house got moved back, and that was definitely the right solution for that particular property. And one of the things that followed from this situation is, of course, that homeowner wanted to provide some armoring in front of the home, but recognizing when you put armoring in front of one property, that's going to have an immediate impact on the upstream and downstream properties. And so the city of St. Joseph incorporated a new development line to say this is the line where we will allow development to occur, and that includes shoreline armoring. And we can debate where that line goes and what are the coastal engineering strategies used to establish the placement of that line. But the key benefit of that line is it creates predictability for all these other homeowners that we have a line to build to, we understand where we can go, and it takes into consideration coastal engineering factors to provide the safest environment we can. So that's a strategy that's being implemented in communities around the Great Lakes for consideration there. This is another property. This is a public property here on the south side of the pier at South Haven, Michigan. It's called South Beach. And it's another situation where the community really supported this idea of a natural shoreline. And one of the things with a natural shoreline is you have to be prepared for that shoreline to move. So this is what that beach area looked like before. And I want you to notice this blue house in particular. And the community recognizes, yeah, you know, this isn't at a time of particularly low water. They recognize that, hey, sometimes we're gonna have a small beach, but they didn't want us to come in and take out all the dune grass and, you know, artificially create a bigger beach, because that just opens up the opportunities for erosion even more. Now, at the more extreme events, so there's that same house. So notice all that property out in front here, that same home is here, and they've had to come in and provide some armoring. And we lost a lot of that shoreline from, this was in 2017 or 16 or 17, and this is just last November. And what's interesting in this photo, you can't quite see it, but in the more recent photo, there's actually a very old steel wall that was down here and buried. And it has actually set and established a line. It was fully buried in the sand. I mean, that wall was way back in here somewhere, constructed, I don't know how many years ago, 50 years ago. And that has now helped establish a line where that bluff is no longer gonna recede from. So there are some times and places where we want to work with natural shoreline strategies, but also look at opportunities to say, you know, there is a point at which we have to provide a fixed area so that when the water levels return to lower levels, we can support accretion and beach nourishment and protect critical infrastructure. So it's a balancing act. We've all seen a lot of revetment examples. This is not a good revetment. You see a lot of situations where folks, they just get some rock and just get it out there. And generally, if you're going to go down the path of an armor stone revetment, you really want to work with an engineering team that are going to size that stone properly and help you work with a contractor who will get it placed properly, so it minimizes negative impacts to your neighbors and to the coastal ecology, but will also function. If you're going to invest those dollars, this is going to fail and fail soon. This is a more really a much heavier duty armor stone revetment with very specific sizes, and it achieves a certain goal. One of the things this is not as good as is because this stone is very well knit together, is that doesn't absorb as much wave energy as another type of stone wall might with a less regular surface. So for example, in this one, you can see this breakwater here. These are some larger stones with some more openings and facets that do a little bit better job of dampening and absorbing wave energy. So there's a lot of strategies to consider when you think those things through. How you get something installed and placed depends a lot. This is a very steep bluff on a site here where the only way to gain access was to come in by barge. That obviously makes the installation much more expensive. You want to avoid that where you can. And you know, they brought that equipment all in by barge. Looking at some other strategies, groins. We don't use groins very often anymore because they tend to interrupt that littoral drift pattern that moves from north to south, and it introduces, and almost you get this need for a whole series of these groins. So I wouldn't say never, but we have very rarely introduced those types of structures any longer. The last resort is the sort of vertical shoreline armoring, and in nearly all cases, we try to avoid that because it simply pushes all that wave energy right back into the lake and creates more scour and more erosion. There are times in situations where there's not another real choice. In this case, having the stone wall, having the sheet bow there, all of the stone will go in front of it to help minimize those concerns I just raised. But there are places in Indiana where the erosion is so severe that there's really no longer those options. This is a concrete wall that's been undermined behind. You know, at some point when the water is literally 20 feet from the face of the home, you aren't going to be able to go out and put new armoring out into the water for obvious permitting conditions. So we end up looking at harder solutions and try to put in as much stone as we can, again, to minimize those impacts. You know, a longer term question is, you know, was this the right place to build these houses? That's not a topic for our debate today, but it is a conversation about long-term planning. You want to think about these things when you're building your house, if at all possible. So I'm going to stop there. I know we got a lot of other folks to provide some feedback, so I'll stop now.
Yeah, thanks for that, Greg. I'm sure that's going to generate some questions as well. So thanks for the presentation there. Next person is Mike Utflucht, and he's for the Army Corps of Engineers as well, out of the Buffalo office. Let me see if I can get you presenter, and I believe you still need to unmute yourself, Mike. There you go.
All right. Hopefully it showed up there.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. All right. Well, like Bernie mentioned, I'm Mike Eiflucht with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm a biologist out of the Buffalo district. I actually work in New York State, primarily. Buffalo district includes we regulate both Ohio and in New York, and then Pennsylvania. There's a little slice that hits Lake Erie that's regulated by another district, and Detroit district, of course, regulates a lot of Michigan area. Basically, I just wanted to real quick hit on some permit considerations that we look at. I guess first of all, why the Corps of Engineers need, why do you need to talk to the Corps of Engineers to get a permit at all? And for that, the first thing to look at is we've got a couple of different authorizations. So back in 1899, the Rivers and Harbors Act was first passed. In Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, it basically was one of it had more to do with commerce, but it also had to do with the environmental concerns, and it was considered one of the first environmental laws, quite honestly. So Section 10 applies specifically to Corps of Engineers and what we regulate. It applies to navigable waters, waters that are currently, historically, and could in the future represent opportunity for interstate or international commerce, especially in the case of the Great Lakes. The other thing I want to just real quick point out on this slide, again, I'm going to try to get through these real quick, but is the limit of jurisdiction. So the only for each of the Great Lakes, we actually have an elevation. I don't know what it is, unfortunately, for the other lakes besides Lake Ontario, but there's normally a set elevation. For Buffalo District, we've set Lake Ontario at 247.3 feet based on the IGLD datum. So basically, as soon as anything that's on the water side of that elevation would require a permit from the Corps of Engineers. And we regulate all structures in, over, under, and notice it even says beneath. So if somebody puts in a pipeline underneath the waterway and it doesn't even touch the water, technically it still requires a permit from the Corps of Engineers. So that's one of the two main regulations that the Corps of Engineers has to comply with whenever anybody wants to do any work in, under, over structures. It says all activities. Mostly it means dredging. We also regulate all the dredging in navigable waterways. The other one is Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. This applies to all waters of the U.S. So it includes navigable waters, lakes, ponds, tributaries, wetlands. It includes quite a list of things. And if you're not sure if it applies to a waterway near you, just call your do a Google search. Is probably the easiest way to find for sure who regulates in that area, and give them a call and say, hey, I've got this bog area next to me. Does that require a permit from the Corps of Engineers? And we'll take a look at it and might ask for some photos and might need to do a site visit and that kind of thing. But that's part of what we do, is to try to help make sure that we're protecting all of those waters, but also providing you guys the opportunity to protect your property first of all, and to develop if need be. But under Section 404, we regulate the discharge of dredged and filled material. So as an example, any dredged material, rock, sand, dirt, gravel, if it's fill, then it's most likely requires a permit. The limited jurisdiction, again, is that ordinary high water mark. If it's something other than the Great Lakes, We use visual means to determine where that ordinary high water mark, and then with wetlands, there's a whole science to figuring out where the boundary is. But we regulate to the boundary. Anything that you do on the landward side, the upland side, that does not require a permit. Anything that is on the waterward side, ordinary high water, or in a wetland, most likely requires a permit from the Corps of Engineers. The big thing is make the phone call. Just ask us, and we'd rather help you out on the front end, and try to make sure that you guys have a good project in mind before you guys just go out there and just like Greg had mentioned, we've seen lots of poorly designed revetments where people just are, hey, I've got a dump truck full of rock, I'm just going to dump it over the edge. And we saw a lot of that in 2017, and all of a sudden in 2019, everybody was wondering what happened to their rock. And these are 5-ton stones that just wash away. And so we want to see a good project, something that is going to stay in place. Something just like what Greg was saying, we want to see a good project, minimal impact. The vertical walls, there was an excellent example of how a lot of times a lot of the permitting agencies will ask you to put a vertical wall behind an existing vertical wall. To get a new vertical wall, it's in most instances, it's probably a little bit difficult. I know in New York State, it's very difficult to justify a new vertical wall that's in the Corps of Engineers jurisdiction. So permits, some of the activities and structures that require permits, any type of dock, boathouse, riprap, stone revetments, protective structures, break walls, jetties, seawalls, groins. There's pretty much if any of it extends beyond the ordinary high water mark, it most likely requires a permit from the Corps of Engineers. For New York, Buffalo District would be New York and Ohio. Buffalo District would be the first place to start to figure out. Again, Pennsylvania, I believe it's Pittsburgh District, and then Detroit District covers much of Michigan, and I'm not 100% sure with Wisconsin. But get a hold of your local Corps of Engineers regulatory office, and they'd be more than happy to answer your questions and help you out. We've got a couple of different types of permits. We've got some general permits. So we've got nationwide permits. I'm going to really quickly hit nationwide permit number 3. So this authorizes the repair, replacement currently serviceable structures or fills with minor deviations. This is probably one of my favorite permits because people don't realize that when they go out and do repair work on their existing docks or existing structures, it actually requires a permit from the Corps of Engineers, and we have one that's actually ready for use without even having to come and see us. So we kind of try to cover some of that work without having to submit an application every single time. So nationwide permit 3 is a great permit if there's an existing structure there. Again, if you have any questions, if you're not sure if that permit covers your work, call your local regulatory office, and they'll help you out. Nationwide 13, bank stabilization. We have certain criteria. If you go over that certain criteria, we can waive some of that criteria if we coordinate with the EPA and a couple other things. That 500 linear feet, we can approve more than that, but again, we might have to do some coordinations. Nationwide permit 19 allows for some dredging, 25 cubic yards of material, as long as you're not dredging in wetlands. Just a couple of the nationwide permits that we have that might apply most likely to shoreline work. Here in New York, we've actually got a general permit. We've have an agreement basically with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and basically, if you qualify for the DEC's permit, then you automatically fall under these, and you don't even need to send us an application because it's what we call a non-pre-construction notification. And one of these 3 permits would cover that work that the DEC authorizes. So it's kind of we try to streamline it a little bit so you guys can see the DEC if you qualify for the GP. And the DEC just came out with a new one for 2020, so the number here is not the correct number, but it should be 20-004 for those of you guys in New York. But get with the DEC, Pennsylvania EPA, Ohio EPA, Michigan DNR, and they'll be able to help assist you too, because a lot of times in every state you're going to need a permit from us, but you're also going to need water quality certification from a state agency. And in Michigan, the DNR actually handles a lot of the Section 404 of the Clean Water Act stuff. And then there's a higher level of permits, individual permits, and these ones, anything where just call us. We'll point you in the right direction. When you submit an application to us, if it falls under a nationwide permit, those are easier for us to issue or to verify. We'll help figure it out for you. You don't have to figure out which permit applies where. We might need some additional information for individual permits. It's a longer process. And then there is an emergency permit authorization, but this is pretty well, I can't say difficult, but it's harder to get just because it takes a higher level of authorization. Even our district can't approve it. It's a division approval at least, and it does provide an abbreviated process. But then with all of our permits, at the very bottom here, I highlight this other authorizations for both individual permits, emergency permits, and even a lot of the other permits. We're going to need state permits, water quality certification, and coastal consistency concurrence are almost always required before our permits are valid. So you're going to need to get a hold of the state and the Corps of Engineers is your best bet. In New York, it's a little bit different, but you can always call us and we can point you in the right direction one way or the other. And we're here to help out. We're not here to slap your hands, unless you've just thrown a bunch of material in the waterway already. We're here to help everybody out, protect your property, give you guys the opportunity to protect your property, the opportunity to access the waterway, while keeping the waterways clear for commerce and for to ultimately help the environment. Some of the considerations that we have: recognize the right of the landowner to protect their property from erosion. It's right in the Code of Federal Regulations, so that is your right to protect your property. Consideration of and balancing following factors: we need to look at the need for the project. If you say, hey, I need to protect my property, and you don't have any type of structures on your property, we might take that into account. Even though you have the right to protect your property, what exactly on your property are you protecting? But then we look at navigation impacts, access to, in New York, the access to Lake Ontario, but to all the Great Lakes, safety, impacts up and down drift properties. When you put a wall in, I think it was Greg mentioned that you can see erosion up and downstream of, or up and down on the lake, where it'll actually eat away at the neighboring property, and all of a sudden you go from having to hard armor one property to having to armor the entire lake shore to be able to protect everybody's property. So we really do like the less invasive the less invasive things, like in St. Joseph, Michigan, where they were able to say, hey, we don't want any construction beyond this point. And then the effect on aquatic resources, the littoral drift system, which is that sand drift back and forth along the shoreline, and other environmental factors that we look at. And that's part of why it's mostly biologists that are in the regulatory side of the house, because we are really looking at the environmental impacts that come when we issue a permit. And then the effectiveness of the protective feature: since we are biologists, it's not an engineering assessment, but we are going to, based on our experience, we're going to say, how do we know that this is going to work? And you realize that my permit also requires you to to repair that structure to the permit, to whatever we permitted. So if the rock all drifts away, we expect you to go and find that rock and put it back on the shoreline that's part of the permit, part of the maintenance process. Again, I'm trying to keep this short. There's a ton of stuff, some references in the state of New York, the DEC. The second is our website for Buffalo District. And we actually have some high water, specifically some stuff about the high water on our website, and that's that third link there. For the other states, do a Google search, figure out who covers it, call your state, either look for the the state office that covers you, ask them about the Corps of Engineers, see if you're going to need a permit from the Corps as well. Most likely you will, and most of the states and the Corps work pretty well together. So that wraps it up, Bernie, and hopefully kept it short enough that there's a lot more to it, but
yeah, no, that was great. Thank you for that. So there's a bunch of questions that came in. So for those,
I'm sure there is.
For those who got to put questions in, I do have them. We'll go through those in the end, time permitting, obviously. But Mike, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm going to ask you a question anyway. So when you went through this, you were talking about Army Corps of Engineers permitting, and this is obviously relevant to the state of New York. And it took you a while to come to the point that the DEC in New York obviously has a big opinion on this as well. And I think you're suggesting that there's a process that takes care of both in a single application and for repairs for this GP 0-20-004 is essentially self-certification.
In the state of New York, it's not a self-certification, but basically the DEC, the DEC has a general permit. Basically, they call it an emergency permit. That if you apply to the DEC, you're already covered with our permits for either maintenance, base stabilization, or minor dredging.
Okay, and then it's up to people to find out what that is for the other states. Thank you.
Right. I don't unfortunately have the answers for the other states.
That's great. I just wanted to clarify. Thank you for doing that. David, if you could unmute yourself, and I will make you the presenter now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, but it's not letting me make you presenter for some strange reason.
Ah, that's odd.
That's very odd. Because I'm usually better at this. There it is. I don't know why that took me a minute. I apologize. I warned you up front, so you should be good.
Okay, very good. I'll just bear with me for a second here. I'll just get my screen oriented. Can you hear me okay and see me okay now?
Yes and yes. I'm going on mute.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Dingle. I'm the chair of the Historic Murray Canal District Advocacy Group. Our group is one that's been in existence for about 7 or 8 years, and we are an odd creature that occurred because of the confluence of 3 different municipal areas and 1 federal parks preserve, which is called the Murray Canal in southeastern Ontario. And there were a number of issues that over the years we've advocated for because there was such a complex intersection of different governmental entities and agencies. And so that led us as a group to take on the challenge of trying to assist with the mitigation and prevention of flood and erosion issues in this area. And we took that on because of amongst our members in our group and myself, we had all encountered serious difficulty dealing with the clunky permitting process that we face in this part of Ontario. We deal with 2 conservation authority agencies. These are features of the provincial government that are established for collective municipal groups across the province, and they each enact their own legislation under the General Provincial Conservation Authority legislation, and they frankly represent a bit of a patchwork of policies and discretionary authorities that they exercise over what people are allowed to do to mitigate flood and erosion risk. So in a nutshell, we decided that this was a task that we would take on. And in our advocacy work, we work cordially and respectfully with our government agencies and partners, and we made some progress on this issue, and I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of what we did. So first of all, we started back in around January, and we were trying to understand how to improve the speed of obtaining permits from our local conservation authorities. And we've come across some things that we think are helpful and people across the province would want to know about these. And as I was listening to Mike speak about his national work permit number 3, which basically is kind of an emergency permitting regime, if I heard correctly. Our work quickly focused in on the emergency response scenarios where we could see the impending flood risk coming for this spring, and we wanted to find a way to do things much more quickly than is typically possible with the Conservation Authority permitting process that we face here in this part of Ontario, and I think this is generally the case across the province. So we started out and we spoke with some of the leading larger Canadian engineering firms that do shoreline work and environmental work more generally, or geotechnical work. We got their perspective, and what we were able to learn was that the major challenge across the board is the legislation that governs all this typically has an unintended consequence that it seems to obsess over risk mitigation from a liability perspective. And so there is a tremendous tendency for conservation authorities to require engineering, coastal engineering studies to be performed for cases where it probably is not needed, but the legislation tends to cause that effect. And from the perspective of these larger engineering firms, there was a very, I guess, specific reaction where their counsel to us was that planning and common sense considerations should be reviewed before an engineering study, a coastal engineering study is required. And so basically what we found, and in quick order, we found that indeed it turns out with conservation authorities that it is possible that they will require a shoreline coastal study, and that there's really not a need for that to be done, but the conservation authority is in a position where they are able to require it without first referring to or discussing with an outside engineering resource whether or not that is actually truly necessary. And so we actually were able, through a number of test cases, to prove that there are certainly cases where common sense and just planning considerations will indicate to a qualified engineer that there's really no need for design work to be undertaken. And we negotiated with our local conservation authorities, and we were able to get them to accept a coastal engineer's letter of opinion in place of a review or a design in those cases. And what makes this quite valuable for property owners is that it is possible that through this path that the engineer will not need to make a site visit and instead can rely on third-party imagery, on Google Earth resources, on drone footage and so forth in order to look at the property without going into any technical detail beyond which is commonly available through those sources. And so we were able in one case to follow this process, and the cost that the letter of opinion resulted in was in the range of 10 to 20% of the cost of an actual coastal study with design work. And in dollar figures, for around $1,600 shared between two property owners, we avoided what would have been easily 8 or 10 times that much cost. So we are now at the Historic Murray Canal District. If you go to our website at murraycanaldistrict.ca, we are now offering to assist other property owners to follow the same approach as a first step for working with coastal engineering consultants. And this may not result in avoidance of needing a coastal study, but it is the first step and may reduce costs for those later steps if they are required. So we see this as essentially, and I think this is really what our main outcome was from this effort. We see this as a sort of a beginning of telemedicine for coastal engineering, as we call it, where we are now advocating to get more crowdsourced, citizen-led data to be created, and as much as possible to facilitate these letters of opinion as a first step. And so these obviously are options which are not going to be applicable in all steps, in all cases. Engineering letters of opinion should be encouraged as that first step, but the types of limitations that come up in this case are obviously where the conditions on the shoreline are complex. In our case, the conditions on the shoreline were well understood. There was already an existing revetment which had performed well for a large number of years, and there was a small section which already had the proposed fix in place, which was just basically putting angular riprap of a certain size in behind to fix backwash erosion that from wave overtopping the revetments. And in that case, this was a similar path. This was a path that lent itself to not requiring a design, because it was common sense that there was a functioning wall and the mitigation work was all above the water line. There was nothing going in the water, and so there was little to no impact on the near shore area. And so obviously there will be quite a number of different scenarios where this may or may not apply. And so anyways, that in a nutshell is our work and where we arrived. And we think that from the perspective of next steps, we have submitted this brief to the provincial caucus of the provincial government, the cabinet caucus, and we have requested that in upcoming legislative revisions for conservation authority entities, that the policy of taking the first step of getting a letter of opinion for permitting should be considered. So we're hopeful that the federal government will, or sorry, the provincial government will consider enacting these policy changes. So we stand by and we're available for assistance and to share this information with anyone out there who would like to pursue a similar path. And that's it for me.
Yeah, Dave, thank you for that. It's kind of interesting, sort of a community-led engineering support in cases where, the repair isn't that extensive, right? I mean, is that kind of the major point that you're trying to make with this?
Yes, that's really what's happened. We've had property owners join together along a contiguous piece of shoreline to share costs, and we've supplied resources and assistance to help people gather the necessary information to feed into this process. And I was, you can see here my poor man's GoPro over on the right side, which was basically put a GoPro camera on the top of a windsurfing mast to get imagery of the shoreline from out in the water a little bit to supply to the engineer. And we think there's a lot of potential for this kind of thing to ease the process and shorten the duration of the effort and greatly reduce the cost.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you. So that concludes the prepared presentation, and I'll now go to Q&A. And let me see if I can do this right and get my screen back there. And got to move that over. That should be working. Everybody should now just be seeing the view on Lake Ontario. So if and I'm going to go to the attendees, if all the panelists could please unmute themselves, we'll go through the questions. There's a number of them that came in, and one that came in pretty late that I think I want to ask first, which is, do any of the presenters own lakefront property, and do any of them have value at risk like many of us do? I'll go first on that one, then turn it over to the remainder. So the picture that you're looking at right now is on Lake Ontario. That's off my back deck. So yeah, I have a very vested interest in this. I'm heavily engaged in Plan 2014 review. I'm a member of the public advisory group that's reviewing that. But yes, I absolutely have a vested interest. And I don't know about the other folks if you want to speak up.
I could jump in if you like, Bernie. This is Dave Dingle. I have a resort property with about 800 feet of shoreline, and the property in question, where we ultimately ended up using the letter of opinion approach, was that property and some adjoining ones.
Yeah, so go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't personally own any property, but I mean, I've spent my whole life growing up in Michigan, being out on the lakes. My family and I rent a house on Lake Huron for a couple of weeks every summer, so certainly a vested interest in being part of the Great Lakes and the best management of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that comes up often, right? Do the people that are doing the review on this, and do they actually have any vested interest in this? And certainly a lot of us actually do. Yeah, so let me move on to the other questions here. We got about 20 minutes, and we're not going to get through all the questions. The first one, I think, John, is probably best with you, although I'm sure a lot of people will have opinion on it. It's, can water be let out of Michigan Huron through the Chicago River?
Yeah, so I guess technically, yes, there is water diverted out of Lake Michigan through the Chicago diversion at Chicago. I guess a couple things I'd point out. One is just a very small amount of water, relative to the other components that make water levels fluctuate on Michigan and Huron. I guess to put it in perspective, we've discussed this and looked at these things. To put it in perspective, if we've run some simulations of, well, if you were to maximize as much water as could be pushed out the Chicago diversion for a year, what could that even do to water levels over the course of a year? And our analysis show that yes, you might be able to lower the lake by roughly an inch. You'd have to weigh that against significant issues that could be causing downstream, the Chicago system. So, I guess long story short is yes, it's technically possible, and water continues to lead through that diversion, but the impacts on the current high water level situation would be pretty small.
Yeah, and let me pipe in on that one a little bit as well. The other pieces that might be interesting there is the Long Lock and Ogoki diversions going into Lake Superior. So if you then analyze the entire system, all the inflow diversions, all the outflow diversions, and somebody else had suggested the question, hey, can't we go into the Hudson Bay on this? All those can be looked at to some degree. None of those are easy decisions, and in some cases there are legal precedents that need to be overcome. And none of them are going to lower the lakes by 3 feet.
Yep, that's a good summary, Bernie.
Great, thanks. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Or I can move on. This next one I think is a fantastic question, and I've never thought about it, and it's really good. What effect does shoreline protection have on beaches in the event that lake levels decrease in the future? Does shoreline protection ruin beaches permanently? And I think that's one to Greg, maybe? But really anybody can speak up, right?
Sure. I'll take a first pass at it. I think the answer is it depends. We have a lot of homeowners who ask us to look at their properties, and they have two concerns. One, they want to preserve their beach, and two, they want to preserve their home. And sometimes those are incompatible, but oftentimes if they have enough, I just call it defensive depth. If they have enough depth between the water's edge and their home, we can look at putting an armoring system in back within the area, well back from the water, that sort of says, here's a line in the sand, literally, beyond which we're not going to let the lake advance towards the home. And then you would have the beach in front of it, and then at some point during high water, the beach may erode to the point where it reaches the armoring system, but it stops there. Depending on its location and the littoral drift patterns and adjacent properties, it's entirely possible that some of that material could return either naturally through accretion or through a beach nourishment program, and sorts of things. So I don't think there's a general answer that would state that the beach is automatically going to restore itself afterwards, but in many cases that is a possibility if the drift patterns are not interrupted elsewhere.
I guess I'd also add that is a really good question. We don't have a clear answer, but it is something we're concerned with from the core perspective too. Is that and we've begun studying this question of if we armor a high percentage of our shoreline and now are starving the system of material that would otherwise have been making its way back in to replenish our beaches, are we going to see long-term impacts from that? And so we started collecting data in the New Buffalo area to start to try and get a better handle of what could those long-term impacts of all the armoring be. So I think it's a good question with an unknown answer at this point.
There's one more thing to add. This is Greg again. There are alternate strategies to armoring the shoreline itself that are under consideration and have been installed in other areas where the armoring is actually placed offshore, where the idea is that you would have an offshore breakwater that is either visible or is submerged, and when placed and oriented properly, which requires a lot of both numeric and physical modeling, the idea is to place those breakwaters in a way that they trip the waves as they come in to reduce wave energy on the shoreline, which allows you to have a more natural shoreline, but also have the ability to direct the natural littoral drift patterns to direct the sand to accrete in desirable areas and away from undesirable areas. There are examples of that in Fort Pierce, Florida. There's other examples on Lake Erie, and we're in the middle of working on one for Illinois Beach State Park on the west shore of Lake Michigan. So depending on your state, the permitting agencies have more or less experience with considering those ideas, But that's another strategy for consideration.
Yeah, there's actually a follow-up question on this as well from somebody else, which says Pinellas County, Florida has successfully used a government-funded beach nourishment project. Would it be possible to use something similar on the Great Lakes?
I can take a stab at that from a core perspective. I guess it could be technically possible. We don't currently have any legal authority to do that on the Great Lakes. They do at certain areas of the ocean coast. The Corps has authority to beach nourish, but we just don't have that authority from Congress on the Great Lakes. So technically possible, yes, but nothing that we have a federal government program or authority to do.
I mean, that's something that could be considered, right? But it's technically possible.
Sure. Yep.
From an engineering perspective, we certainly know how to do it. It's often used for beach nourishment. If I look out my window right now at the shoreline of St. Joseph, Michigan, they are currently dredging the channel and the piers, and they are placing that material on the south side of the pier, doing a beach nourishment project adjacent to homes that literally 2 weeks ago had completed shoreline armoring systems with steel walls and rock revetments, and now they're placing sand, and now there's 200 feet of sand in front of those walls. That sand will certainly be gone over the next 3 to 6 months, depending on waves and storms. But a limitation in Michigan is it's complicated to permit that because individual homeowners have to have the property, have to get permits for their particular parcels, and beach nourishment is something that's better done on a wider scale across large parcels. And another strategy that is being considered is the same idea of beach nourishment, but it's a question of what is the source material for the nourishment, and the idea that some of the sand material that's moving downstream through the littoral drift pattern at some point goes past the point of closure, which is where the sand essentially drops out of littoral drift, and it's no longer nourishing the beaches. So there are proposals in multiple locations where to essentially mine the sand off the bottom of the lake and use that for beach nourishment. To my knowledge, that has not been done regularly in the state of Michigan. And it's certainly been done in many places around the world. It's just has not been permitted in the past here in Michigan. That's not to say it can't be permitted. It's just to say that it has not yet been attempted by a private entity or a public agency that I'm aware of in Michigan waters anyway. So.
Right. And there's another follow-up question on that as well, and that's, do any of the speakers agree that harbors and large groins not only block sand to littoral drift, but send sand out into the lake beyond the point of closure, and isn't that where we lose much of our nearshore sand?
Real quick, I'll speak on a permitting side. On the U.S. side, it's really hard to get a groin permitted now because exactly for those reasons, because you get accretion of sand on one side, you get it where it takes the sand away on the other side and starts to eat into the adjoining property. And then on top of that, just like you said, that it actually sends it out far. In some circumstances, a groin could potentially send it out far enough to get it out of the littoral drift system. And then as soon as if it's too deep, it never comes back to the shoreline.
Right.
Is basically what we've seen in regulatory, at least.
Yep, no, and then on the case in Ontario where that appears to have had some very detrimental impacts. Okay, any other thoughts on that before I move on?
From an engineering perspective, there's no question that every structure that projects out into the water is going to have an impact, period. So, yeah.
So this next one is a regulatory question. It's a little bit long, but I think it makes a good point as well. Michigan Huron continued to be at an all-time high and over 5 inches above last year. Superior is much better shape at 6 inches below last year, yet the regulated flow through St. Mary's is 4.6% higher than the historical average. I would expect the flow to be regulated lower so that the lakes can equalize. How can this be corrected? There's a lot of blame on climate change, and that is definitely a factor, but month after month, a 4.6% above average will account for roughly 1 inch per year and 8 inches since 2012. In my opinion, this needs to be looked at with some sort of explanation or citizen oversight. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me think about how to tackle that. So, I guess I'd explain a couple of things. One, when the outflow set from Lake Superior into Michigan Huron, one of the primary mechanisms, or one of the primary goals of the plan, is to mimic what would be a natural flow through the river. So if levels are going to be above average on Lake Superior, I guess in a natural hydraulic system that would drive higher than average flows out of the lake. And so that's what we've seen, over this high water period, that, as Superior's level has been very high, the outflow has been high. What you're seeing now, though, part of the plan does, though, try and protect, and either lake, Superior or Michigan Huron, from being too far out of balance from the other. So what we are starting to see here is, with Michigan Huron now staying very high, with Superior getting some natural relief and, dropping back below long-term or below record highs, the prescribed outflow has been dropping. So the plan has been scaling back flows out of Superior now, down to the point where, the gate settings there are as low as they've been since 2013. Hydropower is being restricted beneath their max capacities for the first time since 2013. So I'd say, although I guess the number is still above its long-term average, Superior's level is still also above long-term average, but the plan is starting to hold water to try and protect Michigan Huron.
Yeah, those regulatory questions are always tough to come to. All right, let me cycle through a couple of these real quick. There have been several questions on will we get a copy of the presentation. So this is being recorded. So once I get the recording done, I'll give that to the people that were the sponsors on this, and they can decide what to do with it. I imagine that they will make this publicly available, but I can't tell you for sure what the medium is going to be. Possibly YouTube, who knows? Yeah, but we'll get something out to you. We obviously have your contact information. The next one is, does the state of Michigan provide design guidelines and specifications for stone revetment design? If no, why not? And shouldn't EGLE be doing this?
You want me to take a pass at that one? They have design standards. This is Greg again. They have design expectations based on impacts, but they don't have standards for what a specific stone size is or a specific approach. Mainly because every condition is different, and the liability associated with a specific design in a specific location and how long will it last, it does not fall to them. They're a regulatory agency that reviews proposals for environmental impact, and they rely on coastal engineers to review, do the analysis, and make recommendations and follow all the national standards and expectations of the coastal engineering profession to provide a safe and functional wall.
Okay. Here's one that actually tails back to a couple of the earlier questions about the impacts of putting a revetment in our neighboring properties. This one was specifically to Greg, but obviously everybody is invited to speak on it. My direct neighbor to the south of us is planning on putting a revetment in front of his cottage. We are on a 70-foot bluff where the water level is undercutting the bluff right now. What can we do as the property owner right next door to protect our property from this revetment?
That is a real challenge, and it gets right to the point of when a revetment is installed, it will inevitably have impacts upstream and downstream. Generally, if with this person being to the south, if they're on Lake Michigan, that's often where the new wall is going to the south. That may have slightly less impacts, but it will still have impacts because the water energy will bounce off, and what it generally leads to on a steep bluff scenario is it leads to more armoring on adjacent properties. So those questions are generally addressed during the permitting process through Eagle, and that is the time and place to address the concerns there. But short of extending additional armoring yourself, and of course having not seen the site, it's difficult to say, but it's a scenario where it often leads to more armoring, which is why we try to avoid that in the first place when we can. I guess the recommendation would be it's a situation where you need a qualified engineer to come take a look and propose a specific solution for your specific site based on your soil conditions and slope conditions and what the neighbor is proposing to do.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay. Are marinas considered part of the shoreline concern, or are they considered a separate issue? And I'm going to take that question in the context of, are they treated essentially the same as homeowners, or do they get treated differently? I don't know if anybody has a clear answer on that.
I can talk the regulatory side.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so as far as regulatory goes, they need a permit just like a shoreline owner does, and honestly, they almost never qualify for our easier permits except for maintenance. If they are going to do anything in a marina, they probably are going to have to go through a more in-depth permit process, which will include at least coordination with neighboring property owners, so that way the neighbors can say what at least throw in, hey, these are my concerns about that proposal. So at least on permitting side from the Corps of Engineers, yeah, they definitely need a permit to change their layout or to put in. It's treated just like any other property owner, more or less.
Okay, thank you. Real quick question on this one. This is from Michigan. Somebody's asking about a product called Track Bag. It has an interesting geometry, and wonder if any of the panelists have an opinion on it. I have not heard of it.
I guess from an engineering perspective, I'll take that one on. There are dozens of products out there. The only thing I can say from an engineering perspective is we most of the time do engineering solutions for longer term strategies, and by engineering I mean anything from a natural shoreline to some type of built armored protection system. We generally think of these products as more of a temporary solution, and that ranges anything from sandbags up to, generally these things kind of fall into the category of just bigger and bigger sandbags, and it all comes down to weight and mass. And what we generally find is if you want to put in an armoring system of some kind of a heavy stone material, the mass of any of these other products is just generally so low that they're a temporary measure usually. To do something that's going to be meant to be on a more permanent basis, we wouldn't recommend a solution like that. That tends to end up with something like a steel wall with rock in front and preferably back in behind in the sand, so it's not right on the water itself. But that doesn't mean it won't potentially work well for a temporary solution.
Yep.
So that's just be sure you understand what you're trying to make it do and how long you expect it to last.
Okay. There are two more questions I'd like to get to. We have 2 minutes. One I'm going to answer upfront from my perspective, and then hoping to get everybody else's thoughts. This is what flipped the water level switch in 2014, particularly for Lake Ontario. And the answer on that one really is fundamentally that the water supply. Right, and it's not, on Lake Ontario, which is what I'm most familiar with, it's not just a matter of water supply coming in from Lake Erie into Lake Ontario and rainfall directly on the basin, but because of the regulatory plan, whether you're talking 50 AD or 2014, the Ottawa River has a big impact on that. So 17 and 19, you had a very high Ottawa River freshet in spring, both in peak height and in duration. 2018 and 2020, those did not occur, and you can see the difference in the results despite Lake Erie still flowing in pretty high. So it's not the regulations, it is the water supply and the fact that we do need to regulate it on Lake Ontario, but I can't speak to the other lakes. I think, John, you covered a lot of that early.
Yeah, I don't give the same answer, boils down to the same water supply situation, so I think your answer translates across.
Okay, great. Thank you. So then the last question, this I thought was a really good question to finish with, is has the Corps, any other organization, done a systematic controlled study of what system is most effective at combating shore erosion?
I am not aware of a comprehensive study looking at, I guess, at best shore erosion protection measures, no.
Yeah, I'm not either.
Answer for that.
Yeah, I'm not either. So that was John, or was that Greg? That was Greg that just answered that, right?
No, I think that was John.
Okay.
All right, yeah, that was John from a Corps perspective.
Yeah, sorry. Greg, do you have any thoughts on this?
You know, we tend to approach everything on a case-by-case basis. There are national standards we use, but it's really based on experience, and that's, you know, it's so hard to provide an overview strategy without being on site. That's the trick part.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well,
And from a permitting perspective, Greg said exactly what Greg said. I've seen a lot of things, and it's a case-by-case basis, because something that works in Sandy Pond, Lake Ontario area might not work on the St. Lawrence River, just as an example.
Yeah, true. So we're at the 1 o'clock hour. It's been an hour and a half. I want to thank you all again for presenting, and thank the audience for what I think were really good questions. We didn't get to all of them, and we need to figure out a way to get all these questions answered and get those questions back to you. We obviously have a record of who asked what questions, and respecting everybody's privacy, so I didn't read the names off and will not do so. But thank you all. Hopefully it was worth your while. It certainly was mine. And with that, goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.